The Santa Cruz V10 is one of, if not the most iconic downhill bike of recent years, and its inclusion would be a non-negotiable for any self-respecting downhill group test. In fact, we knew it was going to play a big role since day one. Either way, this bike shares the same recognisable silhouette that has often made the V10 so distinctive, plus is already blooded with great success on the racing circuit.
Okay, so Henry, first things first, why didn't we include the V10 in this field test?
Well, that's a really good question. So this is a bike that yourself's actually been conducting a long-term review on, and we didn't think it was going to quite align with the published date for the field test. However, because you clearly all want to see how it stacks up against the other copper bikes, we thought we'd shoehorn it in. Now, one thing to say is that it doesn't have the same test tyres on. They're all really good high quality tyres. It's not going to make too much difference, but that is one note. And I've just been trying to catch up, clock some miles to then reflect on the bike as well. So Matt, this is one of the winningest bikes. It's often graced the top level of a World Cup podium. What makes a V10 and just so iconic?
Yeah, I mean, it's won multiple World Cups. It's an evolution. So this one's still carbon, has tons of adjustment. They've fine-tuned the shock and the leverage rate. So this one's really dialed in. They haven't changed a whole lot from the outside, but inside when you get into the nitty-gritty, yeah, there's a lot more changes going on here.
Yeah, totally. I mean, compared to the old one, apart from now having like a briefcase carry handle, it does look to be quite a similar bike. But one thing this has got loads of is easy, effective adjustment, which is great to see. Not the same bike then, but not totally different either. But is that so surprising? As the saying goes, if it's not needing fixing, why break it? Or something like that. The V10 covers a lot of good ground without seemingly having a chink in its armour. How? Matt, I'm going to ask you a really stupid question. All these bikes are made to be fantastic in the bike park on lift access trails. How then? How can the V10 be such a good all-rounder? And does that even make sense?
Yeah, I think it does. I mean, the YT was close in saying that, you know, it could like be raced with their World Cup team, or it could go in the park or whatever. But the V10 is just a little more adaptable in either direction. There's just more adjustments. It's slightly more aggressive, which I think kind of embodies what a downhill bike is. And if you look around, there's a lot of privateer racers on this bike, eh?
Absolutely. I mean, it has, if we compare to some of the other geometries of the test bikes we've had in this group, it is a very aggressive bike, but it never feels, you know, it doesn't suffer from either on one side, say, the wheel flop of the Giant, nor does it feel from that sort of almost sharp edge of the YT or the frameworks.
Yeah.
It really feels neutral.
Yeah, it's that like Goldilocks feel. It's neither too steep or too slack. The chainstay isn't like overly long. It's not a high pivot, doesn't do any weird elongating things. So yeah, it does have a nice neutral yet aggressive feel, hey?
Absolutely. And one thing I really liked about this bike is, speaking of sort of a neutral feel, it's got a really great blend between, at least for my desires, of stiffness and compliance.
Yeah.
You can carve turns, but it also doesn't feel like it's going to spit you out.
Yeah, it's like, you know, carbon frame, so it's could be on the stiffer side, but this has got aluminum wheels, so it kind of has that rigid frame feel with a little bit more flex in the wheels, which is personally what I prefer. But I think a lot of racers too, like we talked about, what most of the World Cup racers are doing now, and they're going to aluminum wheels to get that compliance, and that's exactly what we see on that bike there. Yeah,
and another thing that thought was quite interesting is, this is a bike that, how to put this, I think if you look at the really popular privateer bikes, or even, you know, the most successful bikes in the World Cups, it tends to be a V10 or a common cell.
Yeah.
But they ride very different. I would say this doesn't have the sort of ground hugging effect of the common cell.
No.
It's a bit stiffer, but also it feels like if you want to ride it, like again, a wider remit of trails, you want to be really pumping the bike, it doesn't have that suck to the ground issue on jumps. It feels like it's really happy to take flight.
Totally. Yeah, you can, you know, push into the ground, get momentum, or you can kind of stay light and let the bike kind of flutter. It does both of those moderately well, but not as like one-sided as some of the other bikes do.
One thing I did notice, and it's also, I need to acknowledge my own preference here, I like to run a really fast rebound setting. And much like it happened with the Giant as well, and it's something that does happen from time to time with coil shocks, I did find myself tuning my rebound setting to avoid top out, not to affect shaft speed.
Right.
And this did have a noticeable top out when you were getting towards the more open settings.
Yeah, and you mentioned that was your preference. I was a little bit slower, but it's definitely a trend that we see. People are running faster rebounds with softer spring rates, eh?
Absolutely. But yeah, it's something that you might notice if you end up on the limit like I am. We've mentioned adjustment. But what exactly are we dealing with?
So we mentioned how adjustable the V10 is. One thing that's really neat and kind of helps bridge all those gaps between each frame size is that the reach can be adjusted with a nifty cup, and that comes stock. It's not something you have to buy aftermarket. They've done a really tidy job at this. It's well finished with a nice O-ring that seals all the dirt out, and that's very easy to flip. You know, it doesn't take extra tools or weird proprietary stuff. That can be done relatively quickly in the parking lot. And there's more at play. There's another couple adjustments, hey?
Yeah, totally. So you've got a flip chip on the shock, and you've also got chainstay length adjustment. And the way the brake mount is incorporated into that chainstay adjustment, it makes it a lot easier. I think that's one thing we're seeing with this generation of downhill bikes is how they're incorporating and how easy they're making these adjustments. And to your point with the headset cups, one thing you're seeing with these carbon bikes is they can do things like that because they have a bit more freedom when it comes to tubing profile. You can hydroform and, you know, a metal bike, an aluminium bike, but you'll tend to find they run just a plain gauge circular head tube. Now that isn't a problem, except you've got to line it up. And if you're a big rider swinging off it under harsh compressions, they haven't even been known to twist slightly.
Oh.
So I like this set of sort of, you know, non-circular, sort of almost like a flip chip headset.
Yep,
I think it's really,
exactly
really
what
neat.
it is.
One thing I've always liked about the V10 is when we look at something like another, you know, I mean, all these bikes are race bikes, but something like the Commencal, which could be described as having somewhat convoluted routing for the brake and gear cables. This is a lot cleaner. The hose just runs straight down through. And if you ever work on one of these bikes, you'll notice that if you want to swap out the bearings, it is incredibly simple because they're pressed into the links themselves. And you can do one link at a time, which means you don't have to disassemble the whole bike. And actually, Santa Cruz, at least in Canada, are starting to supply their dealers with already furbished, you know, links. So you just go and you just swap at the shop there and then. And I think it's such a nice touch. You get a warranty on bearings anyway, but it makes it feel like, you know, all these bikes are, you know, essentially really good bikes. They're very premium products, but it makes it feel like you get a bit more for your money in terms of the aftercare service, which I think is a really nice touch.
Yeah, this one's really well polished. Like you mentioned, it's easy to work on. You can remove the shock. There's nothing rattling, nothing loose. So yeah, like we said, it's an evolution. They've refined this even further and just, you know, nipped and tucked everything to the finest details here. One
thing I thought, you know, when we talk about evolution, it's funny with brakes, you know, what was once considered really good quickly gets outstripped. And we're just talking about it off camera, but, you know, when the code came out, it was a really powerful gravity brake. Now we've just kind of got spoiled. And I'd be more tempted to put it almost on like an aggressive trail bike than I would a downhill bike.
Totally.
To my mind, on long, steep, sustained runs, they did begin to feel a little underwhelming at some parts.
Yeah, you know, you can see on the World Cup scene, like there are still riders using these and they do work well. They're consistent, they're easy to find parts, simple to bleed. But yeah, they don't have that, you know, overall power of say a Maven or a Saint. And on longer descents where you're just holding the brakes and you are off and on them a little bit more frequently than say just like riding a flatter track, they do heat up and they don't have the same overall power that you'd look for on like a true downhill brake.
Were there any things in this bike that maybe had you questioning it or that you spec parts you didn't like?
I would say that carbon cranks probably out for downhill bikes these days. You know, it's sort of like an extra boutique thing. They don't really save much weight and they're gonna hit the ground. Like I want that area of the bike to be pretty robust and reliable.
Who's the Santa Cruz V10 for?
I mean, you look around the park, you see like shredder Grom rippers on that bike, lots of privateer racers, but even just the average park rider, I would say, as long as they have the cash for it, it's gonna suit them. It's gonna feel comfortable, it's gonna feel secure, it's well balanced. So it's kind of ready to hit any type of downhill track or jump track even.
Yeah, totally. I mean, we talked about it before, but this does feel like a really well-rounded bike. Normally, when we come to who this bike is for, we talk about who it isn't for. But this it's hard to pin that down. You know, if ever you were to label the accusation that one style of mountain bike is just a toy, it would probably be the downhill bike.
I think so.
None of these bikes on test are particularly good value, but at 8,600, I think US, it's definitely not cheap. That said, it's similar price to the Giant and cheaper than something like the Frameworks. However, if you've really got an eye on value, you'd be better off looking at something like the YT, which offers a really, really well-rounded bike, even if it isn't as well-rounded as the V10. What's this bike best at?
Santa Cruz really nailed it with the latest iteration of this V10. It's a very well-rounded bike, whether you're racing or just free riding. There's tons of adjustment built in there, and it's also easy to work on. Like the bearings, we talked about that.
Yeah.
All the adjustments, it's just all put together very well.
For cons and the drawbacks of this bike, maybe there's an argument to say that when it comes to a true race bike, something like the Common Style has the edge, and this is more of a jack of all trades, master of none. But I mean, that's a pretty good situation for a bike to be in. I think the only other major drawback that we really came across is if you like a really fast rebound speed, you might find you're getting a bit of top out and you end up sort of tuning out the noise more than tuning the feeling. However, this bike is really, really solid. A bike with 208 millimeters of rear travel will never be an all-rounder in the traditional sense, but the V10 is about as well-rounded of a downhill bike as you could hope to get. It might not have the sheer grip of the Common Style, but it also does without that lethargic feeling on jumps. It might not feel as sporty as the YT, but it also gives a lot more confidence in tech. In some ways, this bike shines because it manages to balance great geometry with an easygoing ride quality and race-ready features, and focuses on striking the best compromise instead of shining at any one quality. This bike is the second best at anything, which to a lot of riders will make it the all-out best for everything.